Kaya Wanju to this episode of Tribal Fires. This episode is titled Close to the Edge. It's a tribute to our young people and young people all around the world as we face the challenges of the massive implications of climate change, war, famine, and all of those challenges that face us as human beings, and challenges that we must find solutions and find ways in which to survive against. So this is an important episode and a tribute to all of the world's young people. My name is Robert Eggington. I'm the director of the Dumbarton Aboriginal Corporation in Perth, Western Australia. I'm a Noongar Bibbulmun man. We have 14 nations of our people in the southwest corner of Australia. And I've been director of the Dumbarton Aboriginal Corporation now for over 34 years. I've worked in the coalface of the Aboriginal community for 42 years, meaning that my work has always been through community-based Aboriginal corporations. I've never worked for a government department or a non-government organisation or in the private sector. So it's always been under Aboriginal self-determination and in the coalface, representing primarily the silenced and the oppressed voice of our people on many, many issues. And Dumbarton has fortunately had an open agenda over those years, both based on cultural and political issues. And we have had a major role in the truth-telling of the history of this country regarding Aboriginal people. And over the 34 years of that particular role, Dumbarton's been quite iconic and has travelled the world and featured in different documentaries made by people like John Pilger, titled Utopia. We have many of our own presentations, but we've told that story as deep and as truthful as it can be told. We don't, we don't superficially tell that truth. We don't, tell it in a way in which it's softened for, non-Aboriginal people to understand. So, as you could imagine, that has led this organisation into becoming extremely, at times, ostracised and defunded. There's been many government attempts to silence the voice of Dumbarton. However, I believe our spiritual and our cultural energies and our will to endure has been our strengths to continue this very need to allow the world to know about the hidden history in which this country has, managed to be able to, render null and void to the rest of the world in relationship to their knowledge. Around the world, there is very little known about the history of Australia. Australia has been colonised for 240 years. Even less is known about the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people of this country. There were over 368 distinctive, separate Aboriginal nations that existed on this landmass, each with varying different languages and customs. This history and what happened to our people through a forced occupation of genocide needs to be taken out into the world and for the world to understand just what type of
secret war existed in this country and has done for that period of time, as the government have very, very cunningly but precisely hidden those truths. So Dumbartonga has had a major role in bringing out the truths, and those truths have been based on horrendous processes of colonialism. You know, the British Empire arrived here some 240 years ago. They forcibly occupied our country through First Fleet that arrived in Botany Bay, New South Wales, and in what we call the time of the killing fields, our people were massacred in the frontiers. They were shot, they were dispossessed not only of country, but our water holes were poisoned. Viruses such as smallpox, venereal diseases, and other sicknesses were deliberately thrust into the lives and onto the lives of our people and used as a biological form of chemical weaponry and mass murder. So these truths then led on to, the government introducing the 1905 Native Welfare Act, which, had a whole, parliamentary act that gave the government the right to control our people's lives totally, from the time they were born till the time that they passed. And that act gave this country the right to take the children from the mothers and the fathers, and some of those little babies were still suckling from their mother's breasts, and the whole families were split apart in that dispossession from country and from land, and they were put into church-run missions, and most of those young children died at a very, very early age when they were released from the missions at 16 years of age. Most of them were dead before they even reached 40. That was the then average mortality rate for Aboriginal men in this country. And, it's really been a little bit glossed over in terms of being even called the stolen generations. It's cannot really be seen anything, I believe, less than absolute kidnapping and human trafficking of our children and our people. And our people were put to slavery because, following their time in the missions, they were then put to, task and made work in clearing land for the agricultural developments in Western Australia here, and forestry, and that was paid only in terms of flour, sugar and tea. So the Australian governments enforced slavery on our people. But the stolen generations itself, not many people understand, but Australia was the only country in the world where there was a legislative process where the government had the right by law to forcibly remove Aboriginal children and remove them from their parents, and then remove all the siblings from each other. So what that resulted in was that, being the only country in the world that had ever passed the legislation and a law to do that, that was never done in Africa under the Apartheid Act. It was never done even in America and Canada. Even though the Native American people bore the brunt of severe genocide and colonialism and the Holocaust of colonialism, but the parents of those young kids that were sent to the residential schools still had a right to connect with those children. But here in Australia, the parents did not have the right ever again to connect with their children. All the siblings were split up, so they were, separated from their brothers and their sisters. And one of the most heinous and one of the most strategically defined processes of that law was to take away from our people our emotional human right, which, great men of philosophy and faith and, men of statue says it's our purpose for life, which is love. And they took away our right as Aboriginal people to love. And when you do that and you then just put people on the fringes of cities and alcohol becomes a great problem and, you see those psychological and emotional problems that those young kids were subject to in their missions. They then manifested into physical ailments like diabetes and rheumatic heart disease and liver problems and total body breakdowns physically, mental health issues. And, so it was really like just being hit by a massive, massive bomb that blasted the life clean out of our people. And as I said, many died very early, but the average mortality rate for Aboriginal men during those times was less than 40 years of age. So, Dumbartongue's work in telling these truths to the world has been a testimonial to the endurance, the never giving up on telling that truth, bearing the brutal consequences of that, which meant at times for many years Dumbartongue was not funded by government and we had to generate our own funding to keep the organisation, surviving and going. There were times when we got very close to being so ostracised that, we were making decisions that would, close the organisation because of the fact of that threat. Australia is a country that, has many threats to its own fabrication of its social structures through multiculturalism. And, we hear of the brutal policies of Australian governments when it comes to the refugee problems around the world. And, there is a lot of racism in Australia regarding the plight of the refugees, and they weren't permitted direct entry. They had created Christmas Island and other offshore detention centres, and then obviously tried to define the problems in Indonesia with what they call the so-called boat people. Prime ministers lied about what and how these populations were getting into the country, and going as far as saying that mothers and fathers were throwing their young children overboard on the boat so that the Australian naval vessels would rescue them and bring them into the mainlands. And that was all lies and deceit to gain political popularity for a vote, cheap vote. But the biggest threat to this country was and always will be the Aboriginal threat in terms of the right of who owns this country, who owns this land. We as Aboriginal people, we know that our not just traditional ownership, but our current present day ownership of this land is our birthright from the time in which our people began, evolving in Australia, and our people believe that is from the beginning of time, not 40 or 50,000 or 80,000 years ago. And that, the biggest threat to the Australian social and political fabrication is our right to land, our land rights. Not native title or not, how they may water it down and turn our land into a capitalistic commodity for sale and then have the policies of native title govern that. It's about the right of the fact that this land is stolen. This land has been forcibly occupied by the might of firepower and the strength of alloyed steel against wood fibre. And all of the massacres took place at dawn. So Aboriginal people had very little, if any, chance to survive against such a brutal forced occupation. So Dumbarton, continues our right to tell the stories through truth, and that has, as I said earlier, created many, many obstacles and issues for the organisation. I really do solemnly believe that people around the world has to, regardless of the ramifications and the brutality of regimes and governments, we must remain active. Our activism is so important in relationship to creating change. I've seen many, many Indigenous people worldwide get high degree academic qualifications and work within government departments, believing that they can change the system from within. However, I always have said to our people that you either stand with the oppressor or the oppressed. There is no sweet middle ground of compromise. And activism and being strong and determined, not necessarily violent activism, but certainly, very cleverly thought through processes of the human rights of what we're fighting for, should be our weapons to move forward. And activism, I think, applied in the right way and to unify the masses and as many people as we can, especially by allowing our young people to know the history of what we're fighting for, is really important, because history changes things just within decades. And it is hard for young people today to understand what even happened in the 70s, 80s and the 90s, other than going back any further than that, in which they, in many ways rely on texts and, archives, but, the spoken word, the verbal stories and the stories that are told throughout the generations really are our weapons and our connection to our homelands. And I'm sure that, people to whom fight actively and pursue to put pressure on government for change are fighting whilst their feet are still on their land. Because land and our link to land and what's happened as a result of our link to land, be it either through war or through political decisions or impoverishment, it's all about how our human rights are met on our own homelands. And the one thing about Aboriginal culture, and I think it's really prevalent in terms of looking at how we move forward together as humanity should move forward, is that we don't look for alternatives to empower the systems that just create the status quo. I think that replacing coal and, I am a climate change advocate as well, but I do know that it's not what we burn and what we generate power from that is really the problem. That's what the politicians want you to believe is the problem. The problem lies within the value systems of this world, where people have become so greedy, become so self-centred on their own needs. They no longer care for their brother or their sister that is standing or sitting beside them, And that greed that puts them into a position of the acquirement of materialistic possessions. And that form of greed was never part of the Aboriginal value system. Our life, our old people's life, was never ever about materialistic possessions. And our old people never knew of war as a result of that. There was no war in this country ever, anywhere. And, you know, you had problems amongst different tribes, of course, but it wasn't war to take over other people's country by destroying their history and or their, you know, the representation of their history's objects. And it is one of the greatest values, I think, that, you know, the Western world needs to learn if it's going to change its value and survive on this planet any longer, that, you know, war, famine, and, you know, where all the extinction of all these different animal species, and you can see the results of that now through what people fear is the beginning of the signs of climate change. You know, in our culture, we have the answers to changing that around. But people have got to understand, by doing that, you must release your privilege of wealth that you can only gain from tearing the heart of our mother out, which is the Mother Earth. And whilst we damage the earth to such a degree to you know, maintain this life of privilege in the Western world, you can never, ever be assured that this earth, our mother, will sustain and nurture life forever, because it's a living entity. The earth has all its flora, its trees, its animal life other than that of man, that it's all alive. You know, she's alive. And it's not a dead entity like a lot of Western people see. And another major value system that comes from that perspective and point is the fact that, you know, we don't ever believe that, you know, we can own the earth. The earth owns us. You know, what right has man got to think that he can, you know, purchase land, purchase the earth and the water? And, you know, what right do these huge industrialists have of just going in willfully and blowing up ancient cultural sites? So my message to young people all around this world that have suffered, particularly, you know, through war, and where that trauma of that war, you know, evolves into generations like ingrained trauma. Our young people must understand first and foremost the history of why that is, you know, one part of their life and history that haunts them. And they've got to find that truth their way, because there's not many governments in this world, nor political influences, or even church-based groups that are ever going to tell our young people the truth. They must find that from the storytellers. As the government have very, very cunningly, but precisely hidden those truths. The war can be seen as a form of genocide. And that genocide raged initially on the frontiers of the forced occupation and then through the Native Welfare Acts, and today is reflected in the atrocious incarceration statistics of our people, particularly in the southwest here, where per head per population, our men are jailed in Western Australia, in the southwest, far greater than Afro-Americans are jailed in America, and black Africans even are jailed in Africa. We have the highest population of incarcerated men in the world. We have the greatest pandemics of suicide in the world, self-injury, depression and mental health issues. So in many ways that genocide that started off in seeable actions of the empire and the colonisers have now entered into the mindset and the minds of our young people. And we're seeing that now carried out in the pandemics of incarceration and suicide. And it becomes near a spiritual warfare between us as Aboriginal people and the forced indoctrination of other forms of religion and belief systems. In the 1950s in this country, the British Empire ordered, beyond many Australians rejecting the tests, they tested the atomic bombs in two major locations that affected our people, the great Wongai peoples of the central and the western desert block, the Pitjantjatjara and the Natjara peoples. And they didn't even clear the people, the majority of the people from the area in which lived in and around a place called Maralinga. And Maralinga was where the main atomic bombs were tested of the British. And to this very day, all these generations later, to this very day, people are still being born with little clefts in their mouth and claw-like hands and fingers deformed and arms, and the ongoing atrocities of these tests without properly removing a whole population of human beings from that test area. Our people still suffer in those desert regions and cannot go back to their homelands to this very day because of the contamination of radiation that is embedded into the soils of their tribal grounds. Another area was in the Montebello's island off the west coast of Western Australia, and the winds, of course, blew massive amounts of poisons and radiation into and onto the mainlands that settled in amongst many Aboriginal groups in the northwest. And they suffered these atrocities. So just in the testing of the apparatus, if you like, and the bombs of war, people were not just basically suffering in the sense of loss of life, but intergenerational deformities. And it's an incredible disgrace on an indictment on the human rights of this country that those people that were and lived in those desert areas were never ever compensated, nor ever even given an apology for what the British government had done to them. Dumbartung is a specific and a very important Aboriginal cultural advocacy grassroots organisation. We take pride in the fact that we determine our own decisions, we determine our own priorities, and we are able to work towards those priorities in, of course, commencing and finalising some of the government-appointed projects that we carry out. But our main role really is to advocate conscious change in people around the world that come into Dumbartung for the experience of meeting with Aboriginal people who tell that real story. In other words, Aboriginal people telling our story our way. And it's most important because for decades and decades and decades in this country, we have had academics such as archaeologists, anthropologists, social scientists, others that have always spoke up about our people and our culture. So, Dumbartung has bonded a strong relationship with many Indigenous people around the world. And some of those people that come to mind are, the great chiefs of Toronto, the North American Native Indian groups. We've met with and participated in their ceremonies, the sweat ceremonies, and shared that pain and suffering with our brothers in terms of the warriors who participated in them ceremonies. And there were ceremonies of immense pain. And I started to understand there where pain and suffering forces you into a process of understanding a different form of knowledge through pain. A life and lived experience. And, pain, it exerts that knowledge with the right storytellers telling you about the nature of the pain and the suffering. We had met with for many, many hours the king of the Khoisan people in Cape Town in South Africa, and visited the District 6 museum, and we had travelled out to Robben Island where obviously, Mandela and Stephen Biko and other massive fighters against the apartheid regime were imprisoned. It's where Mandela wrote his book. However, here in Western Australia, we've got Rottnest Island, which I think is a concentration camp of war much greater than is Robben Island. The West Australian promotes that as one of the world's greatest tourist attractions. But they don't tell the people of the history that happened at Rottnest Island. This is again a part of that hidden history of this country. We've met with the Aztec people and the Inca mobs from South America and around those countries. We've had many meetings here with the most senior members of the Maori communities. So Dumbarton has aligned a solidarity of unity, of understanding what we must fight for as Indigenous people regarding our land, our culture, because our culture is not culture as is ascertained in its meaning in the Western world as culture. Our culture is our religion. It's the way our old people lived in association with the land. And the land is our mother. And our word for our land is buja. It's our buja. And when our women are of, fetus and she's pregnant, we call her the name that she's Bujari. So the link between the fetus of the impregnated woman and that of the land is so linked and identified as one that, as we are birthed and we come from this magnificent and this most beautiful landscapes of the world and the planet, we go back to nurture the flora and the fauna that feeds the animal life, feeds and gives life to other forms and to men, people. And of course, so the cycle continues. In our culture, we don't have a belief of a place that takes us away from this world, that we can do whatever we want to this planet, but we're going to be saved in a place called heaven, which is in a realm that one cannot see. So looking after the earth and ensuring that we somehow overcome these insurmountable problems that are now becoming worldwide concerns regarding climate change. We must unify the minds of our young people globally, not just Indigenous people, but all young people, to take up the fight. Not sit in auditoriums like, the climate change, auditoriums and the World Health Organizations or the United Nations, but unify our young people to take a form of activism to prevent as quickly as possible any further damage being done to our mother, because we must ensure that our people and all of the races that make up and constitute this world, that this planet is able to nurture and to provide for them the needs that they need as human beings to survive in a world that currently is so broken and gone wrong. We must be an uprisen people. And my message so strongly to our young people worldwide is to take that fight on and never allow the system to take that fight out of you. Dumbartongue's maxim, and that what we are best known for right around the world, is one statement that I stated at the Kayana gatherings in 1991 on the foreshore of the Derbyl Yerrigan, the Swan River here in Perth, as it flashed through my mind as I saw a burning flame, a tribute to Aboriginal people who had died in custody, was, "May our campfires burn forever." And that's my hope and message for the future and for our young people, is that our campfires literally altogether globally burn around this planet forever. And no form of technological advancement, nor greed, nor what the Western world's desires for you to pursue ever allow those fires to go out. For they are the fires that link us to our past, our ancestors, and a beautiful, beautiful connection to the earth in the most real and the most rawest forms.